Everyone, Dr. Green here. This is the first of our two lectures that are going to cover slavery and then the Civil War. Specifically for this lecture, we're not really focusing so much on the Civil War per se, if only as the more distant historical event than where our readings are, relatively so. Next week's lecture will focus a little bit more heavily and specifically on the Civil War. So what I chose for us to do with regards to considering American literature, especially obviously for our purposes, early American literature, and slavery, was to actually have a chance to hear, read, and learn from a number of voices from the 1700s. So keep in mind that the Civil War ends, as you probably know, in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation, at that point also abolishing slavery. So the readings that we have for this week vary in terms of how far away from 1865 they are. Some of them are maybe about 100 years or maybe a little bit more than that. Some of them are much closer historically to the Civil War and to the official end of slavery in America. But nonetheless, the voices that we have are very interesting. We have, for the most part, authors or stories. They're not all necessarily authored specifically by the person to whom they're about, are all either former slaves, runaway slaves. In some cases, they were free to begin with. So we do have a variety of experiences as we go through the readings. And so this is a wonderful anthology that we're using, which is the Unchained Voices. And what I really like about it is that it gives, as a whole, a very good sampling of the types of voices and the types of perspectives that were in play both in America and then also in England, and I think in some cases in other parts of Europe at this time. The hard part, of course, in choosing what it was that we would read specifically for our course is that, given our scope and given our purposes, I needed to really limit who we were going to read to just those authors who were actually in America and whose stories predominantly took place in America and in the American slavery context. I would encourage you that if this is an aspect of American study or American literature that you are specifically interested in, then you would definitely want to perhaps continue to read some of the other selections that are in here. One of the ones that may be of interest in that regard is Olaudah Equiano's autobiographical account. And his, a lot of times, is widely anthologized in a number even of volumes of American literature. But in reality, he was not actually a slave in America or in the colonies for really that terribly long a period of time. So I went ahead and left him out of this particular set of readings in favor of some of the voices that were much more a part of the American slavery experience. And to that end, what I want to do is to start by giving you sort of a briefer and a broader overview of slavery during this era. And then as I go through the individual selections that we have, I'll give you some notable background about each of those authors and each of their historical contexts, so that, again, it will give you guys a fuller reading of the text and a fuller reading of the story. All right, so the first thing that we have to keep in mind as we approach slavery as a unit, and as obviously as a tragic and unfortunate reality, not only at this time, but in previous eras, and quite frankly, although slavery is abolished in America and has been for some time, there are still parts of the world where people live in slavery. So even though we have come a long way, we always have to remember when we read these stories that these are still, in many ways, the stories and experiences of peoples in other parts of the world. So I would ask you to be mindful of that and to be considerate of that as we read. And hopefully, of course, one day there would come a time where that would no longer be the case. All right, so on that note then, the other thing that we have to remember is that slavery was prevalent throughout the western part of the world, if we want to consider it that way, throughout this time period. And again, our readings are centered in the 18th century, in the 1700s. This is not when slavery starts, but this is kind of our starting point to really begin to see these narratives emerge in the literature that we're able to read and to be able to see these experiences. Obviously, we tend to think of the American with us as American readers, we tend to think of the plantation experience of slavery. And certainly that is a large part of the slave trade. But we also don't want to forget that there was a robust slave trade throughout the West Indies, throughout the Caribbean, and that Europe for a long time also held slaves. The difference really in terms of where the history begins to move is that America, as one of these Western nations, keeps slavery as a legalized institution far longer than any of our counterparts. So for example, far longer than our counterparts in England. So again, as a result of that, the voices and the experiences of slaves and of freed slaves are necessarily going to be different in those accounts of those who are in America or in the colonies prior to independence, and those who might be in England or in other parts of Europe. So again, it's one of those places where we do see a distinction in the ways that some of these stories will be, just based on history and based on where slavery was legally in a given place at a given time. Okay, so what I want to point out first, and where I want to start, is by starting with the colonies' revolt against England and the War for Independence. And keep in mind that the War for Independence, with the Declaration officially being created and signed as a document in 1776, and then the eventual end to the conflict with England with the victory of the colonies and their ability to form America as its own nation, the United States, taking place in 1783, that there were obviously slaves already in the colonies and throughout the Revolutionary period, and their relation to the Revolutionary War is an interesting place to start. There were a number of slaves, in terms of their own identities, who identified themselves essentially as British. They did not necessarily want to become African Americans, if we think of that term that we use now, and in terms of what their identity would have been after the revolution was successful. They wanted to remain African Britons or African British. They were not necessarily as a whole looking to also forge a new identity that was separate from England. And of course, that mirrors some of the sentiments within the colonies themselves in terms of attitudes towards complete break from England as a whole. Many of the slaves that we are dealing with in this particular era, by the time we get to about 1750, most of the slaves about whom we might read and who were in the area at the time were native born. But obviously, some of them, and even in some of the readings that you have here, some of them were relatively newly taken captive from different places in Africa. And some of them in your readings continue not only to remember, but to speak of the lives that they had had before they were taken as slaves. And there tends to be kind of this idea that most of the slaves that were taken from the western coast of Africa. And clearly, if you think about this geographically, that would make sense in terms of where the ships would be leaving port to head with the slaves back into either the West Indies or into the so-called New World, which of course is a bit of a misnomer. In fact, a greater portion of people who were taken into slavery were actually taken from the central portion of Africa and not just from the western coast. And the other thing that we have in this, and the other thing that you've probably heard of this before, and quite frankly and appallingly, I have seen it mercifully. I think you see it less and less, but I have seen people who will speak of slavery and say, well, it happened in large part because Africans were complicit in selling each other into slavery. I hate when I see that used as a means to basically say, well, slavery isn't so bad because white people weren't the only ones doing it. However, the larger issue is complex and does bear us talking about it and considering it before we get started with the readings. It is true that there were Africans who sold other Africans to the slavers and into essentially the white-run slave trade of the Indies, and then also of America. But we have to understand, and what we don't often see is why it is that that happened. We tend to think now of African identity as, even though there are clearly many nation states within Africa, we tend to think of Africa as having its own sense of identity, that you could have an African identity or an African heritage. At the time in which the slave trade was running full steam, that was not the way in which Africa was organized. It was very much along tribal lines. So there might be a case where tribes were feuding or warring with each other, and one tribe would use that as an opportunity to get rid of some of their enemies by selling them to the slavers. So yes, that did happen, and that was one of the means by which slaves were taken from the African continent and then, of course, shipped under terrible conditions to the New World. But we need to remember that this had to do with the fact that there was not a sense of national identity. There was a sense of tribal identity that really set up this particular system, which, as you can imagine, was exploited by slave traders who were going for that purpose to the African continent for that purpose. We have another complication. And this is something that you will see in Phyllis Wheatley, and you also see this, I believe, in Jupiter Hammond when we come to his text. And this is something, again, that is a reality, but it is also very, very problematical. But it adds to the complexity of the material that we see at this time, and some of the attitudes that even slaves or freed slaves or former slaves or escaped slaves had with relation to the condition of slavery, if you will, more generally. There were some slaves and freed slaves who themselves believed what has been termed a fortunate fall. That by being taken into slavery, which is the idea of that fall, that fall from freedom, that loss of homeland, that loss of identity, and all of the terrible degradations of slavery, that it was fortunate because slavery led to the slaves being converted to Christianity. This is a very problematical point, as you can imagine, and I don't really have a good way to negotiate it for you, except as we get to our readings to point out to you where we have that tension. Clearly, there were people who supported slavery, who used the Bible as a means to justify it. What we see here is not so much a means of justifying slavery via the Bible, but we see these slaves, these freed slaves or former slaves, who essentially say, yes, slavery is terrible, but it was also a good thing because I was able to become Christian. So it is very problematical as we see that running through some of the texts that we have for today. Now, in terms of where we were more generally at this time in the 18th century, this is not a time where the abolitionist movement has really picked up, certainly not in the colonies or in the early fledgling United States after the Revolution. There wasn't necessarily a clear majority that felt that it was either wrong or could be or should be eliminated as a means of forced labor. So we haven't reached that point yet in earnest where we are in our readings here. And kind of along those lines, in America after the Revolution, in some ways, for some of the slaves who were here, it actually made their situation worse. So let me back up and explain what that means. American independence from England meant that all blacks who were in the United States were subject to slavery. This was different than the situation that had been the case in England prior to their abolition of slavery. Although there were clearly black slaves in England, there tended to be an understanding, if you will, of social class determining who could be taken as a slave. So, for example, an African man of high social status would not have been considered a subject for slavery, wouldn't have been considered someone who could be taken into slavery in England. In contrast, any black person in the United States was subject to be taken as a slave. And for those of you who have seen the recent film 12 Years a Slave, or have read the actual autobiographical account on which that is based, what you would find is that even being a free black person in the United States did not mean that your freedom could not be taken away, and that you could not be taken into slaveholding regions of this country, and no one would really care in terms of trying to help you or believing that you were technically a freed person. So in some ways, American independence made these things worse. And in terms of giving you numbers, by the time 1776 rolls around, there are about 500,000 blacks in what we would think of as North America. This is about 20% of the population. And a lot of critics will point out the great hypocrisy here, that the colonists were rebelling against England and basically saying that they were being held under unreasonable and completely unworkable tyranny, but yet they turned around and in many ways made slavery a much worse institution in the United States for African Americans than it was in England. So there is much irony that is there. Now, I talked a bit a moment ago about the issue of Christianity and how that is sort of an uneasy attitude that some slaves had with regards to being slaves. One of the other things that is interesting is that for a lot of this time, conversion to Christianity was also considered basically a requirement in order for somebody to be considered worthy of being freed. So the issue of Christianity also looms large here in terms of conversion, in terms of how slaves related to Christianity and how they related that to the reality of slavery. All right, so the last couple of items that I have for you are, again, trying to give you some specific examples that will give you some historical context for these stories. And what I want to start with is examining specifically the state of Virginia and looking at where, or what becomes the state of Virginia, but looking at that area throughout the 18th century. By 1730, the area that we would think of as Virginia, it was about 30% African American in terms of its population, and that had spiked increasingly over the years. Now, what is interesting is that by the late 17th century and into the 18th century, Virginia started to pass what has been known as the Black Codes to essentially restrict freedom and to govern it does govern African Americans and it governs slaves, but it also ends up governing mulattoes and those of mixed blood, and it also in many cases also governs Native Americans. I'll give you two early examples of what falls under the Black Codes. These were a couple of the earlier laws before the code really started to pick up as the 17th century rolled along. So for example, if we look at 1723. In 1723, it became law in Virginia that any slave or free black, mulatto, or Indian person, as the law reads, convicted of conspiracy, and conspiracy would be any group and potentially any meeting of any more than 5 individuals. So you can imagine this was being designed to prevent uprising and rebellion. This was now punishable by death. So the charge of conspiracy, without necessarily a coordinating act of any kind, conspiracy itself was punishable by death. By the time we get to 1732, one of the new laws that was passed was that no black, mulatto, or Indian, and again, those three tend to come up together in what's been known as the Black Codes, they were now prohibited from giving any court testimony unless it was against a slave. And this is interesting because prior to this, they could give testimony, whether they were free or slave, as long as they were Christian. So now the right to be able to speak in court and to be able to give testimony, to be able to defend oneself in court against charges was completely taken away. And of course, unfortunately, the black codes will continue to become more restrictive as the 17th century wore on. But I just kind of wanted to give you an overall background of slavery in the 18th century. And I wanted to focus on some of the details that you may not have been familiar with before as a means of beginning our discussion about each of our specific authors in our book. All right, to that end, let's go ahead and turn our attention to Britton Hammond, who is writing, or whose work was published, in 1760 in the Boston area. What is interesting about Britton Hammond is that he is not writing a strong abolitionist text. And in fact, a number of the ones that we have are not strongly abolitionist. Again, it's a little bit early in some of these cases for that sentiment, but there might also be some other reasons and some other interests that are competing here. What we find, if you remember the previous readings we had on the captivity narratives, there's a lot of structural similarity that you may have noticed there. Not all of them, but some of the stories, and Britton Hammond's is one of them, tend to follow this trajectory of hardship, divine providence intervening, and then success or freedom at the end of it. And remember, Mary Rowlandson very much organized her captivity narrative along those lines. There is some of that same organization in some of these accounts of slavery. Part of the reason for that is because, again, these captivity narratives were very popular. And so it would make sense that these stories and biographical and autobiographical reflections might want to have conformed to what was a popular and expected style at the time. We also have another problem, and this is not just the case with Britton Hammond, but it will be a consistent problem, and believe me, there is a lot of scholarly debate about this. So again, I'm not going to force you into any one conclusion, but I want you to be aware of the issue so that as you discuss and as you read the literature, that you can kind of begin to form your own ideas here. Many of our authors did not write their own stories down. Some of these freed slaves or former slaves gained literacy and were able to read or write, but some of them did not, and some of them were not literate, or not fully literate enough that they could have written their own stories down. So oftentimes they required the work or the secretarial services of a white person to actually record the story. That can be problematical, and there are many critics who fear that the original voices of these people have been distilled through a white perspective. One critic in particular had a quote that I thought encapsulates this argument. He said that these perhaps are black authors, but it is not black authority. I think that we get into very difficult ground. It's hard to know, to be perfectly honest with you, how much the stories were changed or altered to suit the needs of the person writing it down or to suit the needs of the audience. It is really hard to tell. And quite frankly, even though these may not have been written down firsthand, literally, in every case, I don't know that that means that the voice becomes not authentic just by virtue of that. I think that, again, I'm always leery when we see literature is characterized in such black and white terms, because I think we lose the complexity of the debate. So yes, there is absolutely a potential problem of authorial intrusion in terms of the person literally writing it down, in terms of the differences between a white and a black perspective. And the other complexity that we have, and something that you may have noticed about Britton Hammond, is that there's not a lot of emotion in his account. It feels very matter of fact, even though he is often discussing terrible things that happened to him. Part of this is because his white audiences at the time would neither have wanted nor perhaps expected the account of an African American person to be filled with a sense of intellectual grounding, to be filled with a sense of emotional depth. And that is a terrible thing. But again, we can't understand why the literature is doing what it does unless we understand the complexities of attitudes and those competing attitudes that were in play at the time. And quite frankly, that's, again, is the overall arc of the semester in terms of what I've tried to build with a reading list, is for you to see those the competition of voices, the competing voices and the competing interests, political, social, personal, that are governing a lot of why the literature is shaped the way that it is. Okay, so on that note, let's go ahead and take a look at Britton Hammond. So if you go to page 20, the first thing that you notice that is interesting as you begin to read that introductory note that is at that starts his story is that he talks specifically about the horrid cruelty and inhuman barbarity of the Indians, because remember their ship is stuck in Florida and then essentially gets waylaid and attacked by one of the native tribes. What is interesting is that you can see that there forms this sort of racial hierarchy. Britton Hammond on page 21 again talks about the barbarous and inhuman savages. So even here there is a distinct split in identity between Britton Hammond and his racial separateness, and then the natives who he describes as being savage. So again, it isn't as simple as saying that all of the people who were not white were somehow able to band together under a common cause or under a common sense of being oppressed. Unfortunately, as the literature reflects, it wasn't nearly so simple, and that was not the reality. The other thing that we see here on page 22 is a shaping of Britton Hammond's stories, again, Britton Hammond's story, again, along much of the same lines as we saw with Mary Rowlandson. When he talks about, but the providence of God ordered it other ways, for he appeared for my help in this mount of difficulty. Then they were better to me than my fears, and soon unbound me, but set a guard over me every night. Remember that pattern, the Puritan pattern of being tested, of needing God, of remaining faithful, of gaining God's providence, and being delivered. That is much the same cycle into which Britton Hammond's text falls. The other thing that is interesting with regards to Britton Hammond and how he saw himself from an identity perspective, and not only that, but how some of the white Englishmen saw African slaves, or in that regard, is on page 23. When the captain who ends up rescuing him says, but the captain, who was a true Englishman, refused them and said he could not answer it, to deliver up any Englishman under English colors. So remember I told you that there was more of a complexity in England in terms of who was a slave and this sense of identity. Here, the captain of the ship will not deliver him to the Spaniard ship because he is first, Britton Hammond is first an Englishman before he is anything else. So again, this is not something that you would see, for example, in an American text where something similar would have happened, but this happens to him during this early part of his biography when he is rescued by the British captain. All right, so as we move then into Jupiter Hammond's story, which follows immediately after Britton's, the first thing I want to point out is that there does not seem to have been any blood relation between the two. And I think it's weird because your textbook places them one after the other, which makes it seem like they are related. They are not. It's just an unusual circumstance that they have the same last name and they're placed one after the other in your textbook. Now, Jupiter Hammond is interesting because he was the first African-American poet to be published. And that, of course, lends him distinction. And the other thing that is controversial about him, before I say that, it really wasn't until 1970 that all of his poems, which had previously been published kind of piecemeal in different pamphlets or in different newspaper style publications, it really wasn't until 1970 that they were, all of the poems of Jupiter Hammond were collected under one edition. Before that, again, they had been scattered. The other thing that is an interesting critique of Jupiter Hammond, and there is, again, a lot of debate about this, is that he has been criticized as being something that is named an Uncle Tom. I don't know if any of you have heard that term before. Obviously, it comes from the idea of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it is a pejorative term. And it speaks of a slave or a former slave who is complicit in the institution of slavery, who does not speak out against it, who in some ways tries to justify its existence. I don't know if that is completely fair, but it does seem that perhaps Jupiter Hammond was using that as a veneer to protect himself, because this is a long ways away from abolition, and it would have been very dangerous for him, free or not, to have perhaps spoken his heart. So again, you will sometimes see that term of someone being described as an Uncle Tom. That is what it is referring to, and there are critics and readers who level that charge against Jupiter Hammond. Jupiter Hammond's poem that we have that is on page 26, and then goes on from there, is very much Christian in its tone. The opening line says, "Salvation comes by Jesus Christ alone, the only Son of God." And it basically goes through and is very much a praise of Christianity. And I think that you can tell that Jupiter Hammond is clearly devoted in his faith. What is interesting to me are a couple of lines towards the end of page 27, when he says, "Come ye blessed of the Lord, salvation gently given. O turn your hearts, accept the word. Your souls are fit for heaven. Dear Jesus, we now turn to thee, salvation to obtain." This is where I think maybe that Uncle Tom criticism might be one of those places where that could be leveled. Because when he makes a sentiment like this that says, okay, turn your eyes towards salvation into the next life, does that end up making slavery a hardship that must be borne? Not necessarily something to get rid of, but a hardship that tests someone? Again, it becomes a very dicey thing, and I think that's one of the places in this poem where it could be read that way. The other poem that we have for him starts on page 28 and is essentially being written directly to Phillis Wheatley, and we're going to come to her next in our readings. But what is interesting is that he echoes a lot of her sentiments when he says in stanza 2, "Thou mightst been left behind amidst a dark abode. God's tender mercy still combined, thou hast the holy word." This will echo her sentiment, and again, this very complex and very controversial statement that we see a number of these writers making, that slavery was the mechanism that brought them to Christianity. And so again, it creates this very uneasy tension that we see in a lot of the literature, and that a lot of critics notice and comment on, and quite frankly, a lot of those who are the descendants of slaves oftentimes have a very hard time reconciling. And again, we see that here by Jupiter, in the lines by Jupiter Hammond. Okay, so on that note, that brings us to Phillis Wheatley. And I am going to guess that a lot of you have probably read some of Phillis Wheatley before. She is probably, of our particular reading, she is probably the most well-known, I would say, of the ones who we're reading for the course. Now, she is an interesting poet, and she has a very distinct style. And I think that what you would notice is that she oftentimes emulated this kind of neoclassical style. I think sometimes, quite frankly, the poems where she is imitating that really sort of heavily classical style the most are probably the poems that are the least successful. However, her poems were very popular, and their popularity and the skill with which she did write them, although again, for me personally, stylistically, they're a bit overblown. They're not necessarily overblown for the era in which she is writing. Her poetry essentially gained her freedom, and that was the mechanism by which she was freed. She defeated the idea that was prominent at this time that slaves and quite frankly Africans more generally, black people more generally, that they could not learn, they could not be educated, they could not become literate, they could not learn to read or write, they could not forge a sense of artistic interpretation. Phillis Wheatley blows that all out of the water. And what is interesting about that is that Thomas Jefferson enters the fray. And you should know that Thomas Jefferson is, of course, considered one of the founding fathers, but his place in history is much more conflicted because he was also a slave owner and fathered a child on one of his slaves. And whether or not this was an act of rape is certainly a strong possibility. But nonetheless, he was a slaveholder and did not consider that wrong. He actually disparages Phillis Wheatley. He famously said of her that her slavery made her a Christian, but it did not make her a poet. And so I think that he has a little bit of that attitude where he did not want to acknowledge the idea that she could have this level of artistic expression, because the acknowledgement of her level of artistic expression would have to perhaps force him to question in ways that he didn't want to the entire institution of slavery in and of itself. So he blatantly and explicitly disparaged Phillis Wheatley. All right, so as we begin to look at her story on page 59 as she starts this first poem, one of the first things that we notice is that, first of all, she is very young, 17 when she is writing this, and she is also one of our authors who has distinct memory of Africa. She was not born a slave on American soil. She was taken. And she remembers very specifically details of her home. So her identity as a slave is made more complex by her conversion to Christianity. It is made more complex by her uneasy acknowledgement, I think by our accounts, that slavery brought her to Christianity. It is made more complex because the skill of her poetry forced a questioning of the older held concept that slaves couldn't learn, and then somebody like Jefferson stepping into the fray and disparaging her. But for example, if we look at page 61, we see her attitude here with regards to that. Christianity and slaves. Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Savior is his title due. If you will choose to walk in grace's road, you shall be sons and kings and priests to God. So even though she remembers Africa, she is throwing off a part of that cultural identity by calling not only on her fellow slaves, of course, but also on those who are still in the African continent to convert to Christianity. And as we know, if you were to continue along, or if you have an interest in colonial and post-colonial studies, you know that in many instances the conversion efforts in a lot of these areas was just completely destructive. So again, this is a very compelling and interesting source of tension in these sorts of slave or freed slave narratives that we are reading. Okay, so if you go forward to page 62, this is an interesting, the first of the poems on that page that's written to the king. This is interesting because it predates the revolution, but it also shows that she, like other slaves who were in the colonies, had a British identity, and they considered themselves British. And she is one of those people, as you read this poem, who is calling for the King George specifically to repeal the Tax Act, but also to redress the problems in the colonies. But she is not one of those voices that is calling for revolution against the crown. So you can see her attitudes there, basically asking him in the final line, a monarch's smile can set his subjects free. So she is essentially not calling for revolution, but for the king to fix the deteriorating situation in the colonies. The next excerpt that you have, and you only have an excerpt from a much longer poem, on being brought from Africa to America, gets at the heart of the argument of the Christian identity. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, 'twas taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. That is not exactly a rousing condemnation of slavery as a whole, and it is worth parsing. First of all, of course, she sees slavery and her removal from her homeland as a type of mercy, because it brought her to Christianity. However, she does also call out those white people who despise those who are black, but she doesn't necessarily do that in a way that fully condemns slavery, although she does do that later on in the poem in its entirety. But here she's basically saying that we as Africans can also become Christian and will be viewed equally to you by God. But again, this is not necessarily the kind of condemnation that you as a reader might have been expecting from material coming out of this era. All right, on page 64 in her poem on imagination, this is one of those poems that, again, has that kind of affectation of the neoclassical style. I think it becomes a little bit wordy and is perhaps feels more artificial, I think, in some ways than the previous poems, which felt much more naturally from her, if that makes sense, at least in my readings. On Imagination is interesting because she celebrates the artistic force of the imagination. Stanza 4, I think, is indicative of that. Imagination, who can sing thy force? And what is interesting about that is that artistic expression was not necessarily universally revered as something that was positive at the time. There were those, especially who were still of that Puritan bent, who saw the imagination as something that could lead people astray, something that was not a good endeavor. So Phillis Wheatley puts herself out there and privileges the power of the imagination. All right. So let us then turn our attention to Johnson Green, who is our next, the next one on our list. And again, this is another interesting type of a text. Now, the crime, this is basically something that was published in the newspapers to serve as a warning for other potential criminals. And that, I don't think, has anything to do potentially with color as much as it has to do with criminals more generally. The crime for which he is being executed is robbery. And if we were to look at this in today's dollar amount, the amount of goods that he stole that lead to his execution is probably about $9 worth. It wasn't a huge amount, but he was kind of, by his own admission here, an inveterate and a career criminal. The other thing that is interesting, as he is recounting all of the many places and many people from whom he stole, is that he also recounts a lot of sexual relationships with white women. Keep in mind, as we read this, that Johnson Green himself is only half black. He says in the second paragraph that my father was a Negro and a servant to the Honorable Thomas Edson, Esquire. My mother was an Irish woman named Sarah Johnson. Now, I don't know for sure what it was that he looked like. Obviously, we don't have photographs of him, but I would suspect that he probably was light enough that he may have been able to pass for white, and that probably explains some of these relationships that he had. And I just lost my place here. His wife, the woman that he marries in 1781, and this is at the bottom of page 134, Sarah Phillips, he describes her as a mustee, and that means that she was half white and half quadroon. So she's basically 4 times removed from a direct black ancestor. Again, that would lead us to think that Sarah Phillips probably was easily able to pass for white. And that would mean that any of their children would probably pass as white with no problem. Now, I say pass for white because this is a problem at the time. This is the time when we're looking at that 1-drop rule, the idea that if you had any black blood, it made you black. Passing for white is something that those of mixed ancestry certainly might have done because it would make life easier, but it was always under the threat of being discovered for your true ethnic and racial identity and the consequences that that would bring. But again, Johnson Green, I would imagine, probably was able to pass for white, and his wife certainly was probably able to do that. But again, as you read through the entire account, this basically shows, even though he is not fully black, meaning that his physical appearance may have allowed him to pass, he is still very much mired in poverty. And so there are some critics and scholars who examine this text about and of Johnson Green as a lens by which to understand poverty at this time in the colonies and what happened to people who were kind of chronically in poverty. And according to what we see here, of course, Johnson Green turned into a life of crime that eventually leads to his execution. And I hope that as you're reading these, you're enjoying the variety of the types of stories and the types of voices that we're hearing. All right, so this brings us to the brief petition of the slave woman Belinda. And this is one of those, I think this is just an absolutely remarkable, remarkable text. I will tell you that her petition was successful. She was granted her freedom, and she was granted what she had asked for. So again, that makes it an extraordinary text in and of itself. And I wish that Yeah, they don't do that here, even in a footnote. I wish that your textbook had maybe published the response portion of this, but she was successful in her petition. She is another one of our voices who remembers her homeland. She is from Ghana, and she remembers her freedom. She speaks in those beautiful terms of the fragrance of her native groves. She remembers the land literally almost under her feet. It is a beautiful and a passionate testimony. You should also notice that she is, of the readings that we've had so far, she makes use of the court system. She makes use of the law as much as she is able, rather than simply put up with the injustice. She fights it using the very court system. There were other slaves who did this. There were also Native Americans who tried to do this. And I say try because a lot of times those treaties were broken or those cases were not successful in court. But we do see peoples who were oppressed who do try to use the system against the people who are doing the oppression. And in Belinda's case, she was successful. Now, when we see this, it is also a poignant text because she is an old woman. She is elderly here at the end, essentially towards the end of her life. She talks at the bottom of page 142 to the top of page 143 about being taken by ship into slavery. And she says that it was excruciating torment and suffering. But what we probably don't fully understand is that this journey was harrowing and it killed a lot of slaves. And the journey itself by ship took between 2 and 3 months. So 2 and 3 months of literal hell packed into under horrible, filthy, and disease and illness-ridden conditions. And she only speaks a little bit of that horror here because remember, she would have wanted here to have focused on what she wants, which is her freedom. She points out as well on page 143 that the laws are the things that are keeping her oppressed. The laws keep her from being free. They keep her from owning land. They keep her from all of those things that now as an old woman are so important to her because she points out that she was faithful in her service as a slave. And what she asks for is at the very end. She prays that such allowance may be made her out of the estate of Colonel Royal, her master who has died, as will prevent her and her more infirm daughter from misery in the greatest extreme. So basically, she is essentially asking in some provocative ways for payment for her services. She is asking to have a portion of that estate awarded to her now that her master has died. So again, it is a compelling story when we think of the elderly Belinda making her petition directly to the court, directly to the legislative body of Massachusetts, and ultimately and powerfully being successful in that. All right, we're down to, I think, our last couple of accounts here. And the next one I want to take you to is Benjamin Banneker. And he is an interesting figure because many people today recognize him not just for being the voice of a freed slave, but also being the voice of not even a voice, but being an early scientist and an early astronomer. There are many cases now where we look back in history to find those scientific minds who may have been stifled by virtue of slavery, virtue of race, etc. Benjamin Banneker is one of those figures. And what is interesting, for example, is that he accurately, and I love this when I learned this about him, he accurately calculated a solar eclipse that took place on April 4th of 1789. What is interesting is that a lot of his white counterparts didn't get that date right, and he did. And he didn't have any formal training. He was self-taught, and he accurately predicted this. He had a very good understanding of weather patterns. He created an almanac, which has to do with weather and cycles of seasons, planting, all of that. And interestingly, he seems to have gained the respect of a lot of his white scientific counterparts at this time. And certainly he is well respected today as a scientific mind. What is interesting here in his letter is that he writes it to Thomas Jefferson. And there's a lot of debate about why it was that he would have done that. A lot of critics believe that Benjamin Banneker was not fully aware of some of the disparaging remarks that Thomas Jefferson had made against black people and against slaves and against, again, people like Phillis Wheatley. So unfortunately, this is completely the wrong audience on for which to address a piece like this. But this, more than some of the others that we've seen, has a strong abolitionist tone. We see that in the second paragraph where he says, I suppose it is a truth too well attested to you to need a proof here that we are a race of beings that have long labored under the abuse and censure of the world. Again, Thomas Jefferson was probably tone deaf to that particular argument, but Benjamin Banneker is strong in his abolitionist sense that slavery is wrong and it is dehumanizing, and he is explicit in that. He is specifically, as we go down the page on 319, he said he wants to eradicate, he says, that train of absurd and false ideas and opinions which so generally prevails with respect to us. And again, this has to do with the idea that slaves couldn't learn, that black people couldn't learn, they couldn't learn to read or write. He is proof positive of that being false, but he essentially calls on Thomas Jefferson to do that. And part of what he does on page 321 is that he actually quotes from the Declaration of Independence. And he quotes and he recalls, I should say, the colonies and their own push for freedom from England. But again, as I told you, for a lot of the white people in power at the time, this was the wrong message. It was the wrong message. It was the right message to the wrong person, excuse me. Thomas Jefferson didn't see it that way. And when Thomas Jefferson said that all people are created equal, he had a really narrow definition of what that meant. Essentially, upper white class men at the time is what he really meant. He didn't mean women being equal in that way. He certainly did not mean slaves being equal. Benjamin Banneker is certainly hoping that he will be able to find that common ground, that common note of struggle, that common note of freedom. But again, he is ultimately unable to do so. And on page 322, we see Thomas Jefferson's remark, and he pretty much says that he doesn't believe it. He says, nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men. So he's kind of saying, it's kind of one of those backslap compliment kind of things where he says, well, yeah, well, you seem to be a smart guy, but I really don't see proof that that's anything more than an aberration. So Thomas Jefferson is clear in his response that he is not going to support Benjamin Banneker's hope for an abolitionist voice to the cause. All right. Last but not least, we have Venture Smith and his account, which is interesting on so many levels. It's a nice way for us to end the readings out of our textbook, out of this particular volume, excuse me, for today. What you should notice, first of all, is that this is one of those places where Venture Smith's entire account, biographical account, is quote-unquote authenticated by a group of prominent local white men at the time. It's kind of like it gives it a seal of approval and a seal of acceptability for the audience. The other thing that is of note about Venture Smith's account is that he recalls his African heritage. And a couple of our other authors have done that. And even someone like Belinda, granted in a much briefer text, recalls it with much fondness. Venture Smith devotes a great deal of attention to his life in Africa before he was taken into slavery. And this is one of those accounts where another warring tribe basically fought them and took them into slavery, which again is something that happened, as I said at the start of the lecture. He is very proud of African heritage and African culture. And he is even proud of something like the practice of polygamy and is not afraid to speak of that and refuses to make it sound as if his people were primitive or quote unquote savage or any of those things. He is very proud of what it is of his heritage and the heritage that he remembers from growing up. He was also very, very careful with his money. He managed, which is remarkable given the time, he managed to amass a fairly good fortune for himself in terms of property and in terms of actual money on hand. So he did his best to provide for himself and for his family. What is also interesting is that he also is able not only to buy other slaves out of captivity, although that doesn't always work out for him. Sometimes the slaves that he purchases are not loyal to him in return. He also buys himself out of slavery, and then he is able to buy members of his own family out of slavery. It is extraordinary. Okay, so let's look at a couple of things then that are interesting. If you look, for example, on page 376, he talks about this particular master that he was with, and he says he was with, he had been with him for a while when he finally marries Meg, who is his wife, the wife who he ransoms out of slavery, buys out of slavery. But in that passage, he talks about Hetty, who is also one of the slaves that his master owns. But again, interestingly, Hetty is Irish. So again, although clearly we see a lot of African slaves here, there were also some white people who were in the slave trade. Not only here, but also in England and in other places. And here, his particular master also has this Irish slave, Hetty. We also see on page 377 the realities that slaves faced when they did marry and they did have families. It was very rare that a slave master cared about that. And if a slave was to be sold, then the slave would be separated from a wife. A wife could be separated from a husband. A mother or a father could be separated from her children or his children, and children could be separated from each other. And he talks about that here where he is sold to Thomas Stanton, but that separates him from his wife and one of his daughters, who was just an infant of barely a month old at the time. So although his account, again, does not necessarily have a lot of emotional tone to it, that is probably an affectation of the expectation of readers, of conforming to reader expectation, but I think we can imagine that this was a terrible thing. We also learn that the life of a slave was volatile, and you couldn't depend from one moment to the next whether things would be peaceful, and even though you were a slave, you were left relatively in peace, or whether you were going to be sold, separated from your loved ones, or whether you were going to be subjected to violence. And we see that on page 378 after he gets into the argument with the lady of the house, that when his master returns, nothing happens, and so he thinks, okay, I'm not going to suffer a consequence. And then all of a sudden, his master comes upon him completely unannounced and beats him with a club. And he ends up seriously wounded from the blow that he takes. So the life was without guarantee, without any sense of stability, and without any sense that the life that you had one day was going to be the life that you lived the next. All right. So when we get to page 381, he's been talking about how he has been working and saving up money so that he can buy his freedom. And his ultimate freedom is bought for 71 pounds, 2 shillings. And that is a remarkable sum even for this day, but he buys his freedom. And immediately on page 381, his thoughts turn back to his family, to his wife, to his children, who are still in slavery, who are still not able to be free. And he works hard. He talks about basically doing an awful lot of laboring. In this case, towards the bottom of 381, he works as a woodcutter for 4 years so that he is able to purchase the freedom of 2 of his sons. He also, at various points, will purchase other slaves out of slavery. And then eventually, he is able to buy not only his wife, but also his daughter. And he carves out a life for himself. And we leave the story on page 389 prior to those certificates that I told you, the certification that I told you at the start, where he is reflecting on his life as a man of 69 years old. And the life of hard labor has been hard on his body. He was renowned in his healthier years. He was basically a giant of a man. He was maybe 6 foot tall and very, very brawny in his build. And people would remark on this, but now he is almost 70. His back is bent and he has to walk with a cane. But think about everything that he did. He literally broke his back, working and fighting not only to gain a measure of freedom for himself, but then to buy all of the members of his family, one by one, two by two, however it panned out, in order for all of them to be free. All right. So I hope that you enjoyed reading the selections in our anthology. And again, I think the anthology as a whole is a wonderful collection of stories that we don't normally see anthologized in other volumes. Again, I picked the ones I did so that we could make sure that we kept with those that were distinctly rooted in either in the colonies or then in America. But many of the other ones provide a compelling series of voices as well. So certainly, as you have time and interest, I would invite you to explore the rest of the volume. All right, well, that's it for this lecture, coming in just under the hour mark. So I hope that you enjoyed exploring these texts with me. I certainly enjoyed revisiting them again with you. All right, I will see you in the next lecture.